Hi there, this is Dr. Robin Lewis. I'm a naturopathic physician practicing in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And today I want to talk to you about something that affects a lot of us, and that is blood sugar dysregulation. More specifically, how to manage your blood sugars through diet. So chances are you or someone that you know is struggling with your blood sugars, whether that be the early stages or the later stages where someone becomes fully diabetic. This is usually screened on a blood work panel that's done during your routine checkups or investigations of some other complaint. They will find something called fasting blood glucose is elevated or something called hemoglobin A1C. If either of these get flagged on your blood work, your doctor will have a conversation with you, usually along the lines of, your blood sugars are elevated, you need to stop eating so much sugar, or you're going to have to go on medication or develop diabetes. The problem with this conversation is it's incredibly vague. What is too much blood sugar? Can I still have fruit? That's like a healthy type of sugar. What kind of foods can I eat if I can't have this sugar? It often leaves people with more questions than answers. And that is exactly why I developed today's video, so I could really add some clarification on how to eat to balance your blood sugars. And these are the fundamentals of what I believe are a good blood sugar balancing diet. So in today's video, I'm going to be going over the fundamentals of your macronutrients. So your carbohydrates, fats, and protein. How to eat these three things, which make up all of our food, in a way that is appropriate for your blood sugars. But before I dive into that, I really need to define a couple things for you. So when I say blood sugars, I'm actually referring to blood glucose, which is a specific type of sugar. So you might hear me in the video using these things interchangeably. Blood sugar and blood glucose, I'm referring to the same thing. The second thing I want to define for you is a blood sugar spike. You're going to hear me refer to this throughout the video. A blood sugar spike is when you consume food and it quickly releases glucose or sugar into the bloodstream so that it causes an extreme rise in that blood glucose above normal. The reason this is a problem is because your body has to work overtime to bring those levels back down so they don't stay elevated for long. And so this is a much harder thing for the body to do than if your blood sugars were to raise really slowly and never go above their healthy normal ranges. The other aspect of this is when you have a big spike, you're often getting a big crash afterwards where your blood sugars actually dip below what is normal. So this spiking and crashing is what leads to a lot of people's really aggressive cravings, specifically for sugar. So it's actually going to make this a lot harder of a diet to stick to if you're constantly getting these intense crashes that create a lot of anxiety, fatigue, and sugar cravings. So this doesn't just affect your physical body, it can also affect your mental capacity and how well you are able to stay on that diet, which is super interesting. The last thing I want to mention on this topic is that blood sugar spikes are actually incredibly common. In fact, they believe about 80% of the population has these spikes. So this is not just for people who have full-on diabetes. A lot of us could be experiencing these crashes, and it could be contributing to your anxiety, your low energy, your inconsistent energy throughout the day, and your sugar cravings. So this is really a diet that I believe a lot of people, if not all people, should try to follow, because blood sugar issues are not just a problem in people who are diabetic. The third and last thing that I want to define for you guys before we jump into the diet here is insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is actually the precursor to diabetes, or type 2 diabetes more specifically. It actually precedes diabetes by about 10 to 15 years. So if you catch someone in this stage, you can definitely do some good prevention. Insulin is released by an organ called our pancreas, and it is released in response to blood sugar elevation. Its job is to put blood glucose away. So what I mean by that is you eat a meal and your blood sugars will go high. We don't want them to go too high for too long because that is extremely damaging to our entire body. So insulin will take the glucose out of the blood and it'll put it away into tissues like your liver and your muscles, so to prevent that blood sugar from going above its acceptable range. So insulin resistance is when your body has to keep working harder and harder because you keep abusing the system, usually by eating really high carbohydrate diets. And your insulin has to keep working harder and harder and harder to maintain those glucose levels at an acceptable level. Of course, if we eat a lot of foods that cause these spikes, your body's going to have to work hard to make sure that your blood glucose maintains itself. And eventually that system becomes less effective. So you need to release more insulin to accomplish the same goal. And our tissues become less responsive to that insulin. So essentially you're burning the system out because you're abusing the system. So insulin eventually will not be able to keep up with the demand, and that's when you start to see your blood sugars actually go high. So this is why the insulin resistance precedes the full-on diabetes, because until that system really burns itself out, you will have normal blood sugars. But once that system can't keep up anymore, that's when you start to see those blood sugars rise. After you develop diabetes, or more specifically type 2 diabetes, that's when your blood sugars will stay elevated more chronically. So they will be high over a long period of time. The reason this is a problem is because those chronically elevated blood sugars are incredibly damaging to the body. They are a big cause of a certain type of Alzheimer's that develops in people. It will wreak havoc on your immune system. You'll get a weakened immune system. You will notice that your blood circulation doesn't work as well as it could. Loss of vision, kidney function, and people who have elevated blood sugars are at about a 6 times increased risk of heart attack and stroke. So this is no joke. Now I say this not to scare you, but really to emphasize how important it is to get a hold of your blood sugars so this doesn't have to be your experience. This doesn't have to be your life. And diet is one of the most, if not the most effective tool at managing your blood sugars. So today I'm going to provide you with the fundamentals that I tell my patients that I find very effective. If you can get a handle of these things, sure, there's more nuanced ways of addressing blood sugars, but if you can get a hold of these fundamentals, you will be doing a really good job at either preventing full-on diabetes, or if you do already have diabetes, then it will help you better manage those blood sugars and hopefully lower the medication necessary to manage those blood sugars. All right, enough of that. Let's get into the practical aspect of this video, how to eat to manage your blood sugars. The first thing we need to talk about is the most obvious thing, and that is carbohydrates. So again, we have 3 main macronutrients that make up all of the food that gives us energy. So that's carbohydrates, protein, and fat. But what most people don't realize is there's actually many different types of carbohydrates. So there's sugar, starches, and fiber. And they're in order of how much they spike your blood sugars. So something like sugar would be the worst for your blood sugars. Something like fiber, really not bad for your blood sugars. If anything, it's beneficial for your blood sugars. So you do really want to distinguish between the 3 because they do behave differently inside of the body. Sugar is the sweet, easy to digest, more refined type of carbohydrate. It's found in things like candies, pops, sweeteners, and natural sugars exist in things like fruit and dairy. And these are really the things that taste super sweet when you eat them. Starch, which is slightly less sweet, also known as a complex carbohydrate, is found in things like potatoes, corn, peas, rice, and wheat. Now, fiber is only found in plants. It's the bulky, harder to digest component of the plant. It really doesn't taste sweet at all, and it's found in a lot of things like bran, vegetables, grains, and fruit. Now, again, it's important to note that fiber is actually quite beneficial for blood sugars, and there's two different types. There's insoluble, which doesn't really get digested and absorbed at all, and then there's soluble types of fiber. And really, the two types of fiber exist in most types of food to varying degrees. Some might have slightly more insoluble versus soluble, but there's no such thing as a plant that exclusively has insoluble fiber or exclusively has soluble fiber. And interestingly enough, both are incredibly important for managing your blood sugars. And in fact, some research suggests that soluble, the easier to digest form of fiber, is actually more beneficial for your blood sugars. But ultimately, just getting enough of both is going to be helpful. Another reason why I really wanted to distinguish this for you is because when you go to read labels, it can get a little bit confusing. If you look at the back of some sort of food that you're buying off of the shelf, you're going to notice that there is a section for carbohydrates, and then within that section, it's broken down into sugars and fiber. So you can have a high carb food that has very little sugar if majority of that is coming from fiber. And in those circumstances, I'm not as worried about that food. So looking at just total carbohydrates isn't really that helpful. You really want to zero in on the sugar component within that carbohydrate category, because those are the things that are going to be super detrimental to your blood sugars. Now, I generally don't recommend people starting by counting carbs, but more getting used to some of the ways we can eat carbohydrates to make them better for our blood sugars, which I will dive into later. But if you are the type of person who likes to look at numbers, you will notice that there's a couple different categories of low carb. The first one is ketogenic. That's the most extreme of the diets. And that limits your carbohydrates to less than 50 grams a day. Now, I'm not a big fan of ketogenic diets, not because they don't help lower blood sugars. You're not really eating that many carbs, so of course it will help with your blood sugars. It's more because it's not a realistic diet in the long term. So what I'm talking about in today's video is going to be fundamental principles that will carry you forward for your entire life. A ketogenic diet is meant to be a therapeutic diet for a period of time, not your entire life. So that's why I don't really emphasize ketogenic diets. Alternatively, there's low carb, which is around 50 to 150 grams of carbohydrate a day. Now, that's a little bit of a more realistic diet to follow. And generally speaking, if I'm going to recommend anything more restrictive, it's going to be low carb, not necessarily ketogenic. All right, so if you're looking at a specific type of food and thinking, how much sugar per food item is too much sugar? There isn't really a hard and fast rule, and it's more about how you pair your sugar. But if you are looking at it, generally speaking, they want the food to be less than 10% sugar. So what I mean by that is if you get 100 grams of whatever that food item is, we want 10 grams or less of sugar in that food. So that's just a loose guideline for you guys. Again, there's some other things that I'm going to mention later that are more about how to eat carbohydrates, so you don't have to worry so much about counting. But if you want a general rule, less than 10%, you should be safe. When it comes to fiber, as I mentioned earlier, it's actually beneficial for your blood sugars. The issue is the standard North American diet does not have very much fiber in it. They estimate that the average North American is eating about 15 grams of fiber a day. And what I want people to strive for is about 50 grams of fiber per day. So whether that's soluble or insoluble, likely a combination of the two, whatever gets you to about 50 grams of fiber a day, that's going to be really helpful for your gut microbiome, but also for your blood sugars. I will say though, when you first start increasing the fiber in your diet, you need to make sure that you're having enough water, because in someone who's a little bit more dehydrated or just more susceptible, they can develop constipation. And now that's counterproductive. So if you are increasing your fiber intake, do it slowly and make sure you're matching it with an increase in your water intake. All right, so this brings me to one of my first sugar eating strategies, and that is to buffer your sugar with fiber. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you eat something really fiber rich before you eat something that is a little bit higher in sugar, it's going to cause less of a blood sugar spike. So what this could mean is, say you have a pastry gifted to you by one of your friends, it's from your favorite bakery, you really want to eat it, you've being good, you want a treat. What I would encourage you to do is if you can eat something rich in fiber, so like let's say a salad, before you eat that pastry, your blood sugars will look entirely different. Say the opposite, you eat the pastry before the salad, your blood sugar will spike. So if you can eat something like fiber that's going to slow the release of that sugar that you follow it with, you won't notice as aggressive of a spike in your blood sugars. So this is a really cool strategy that you can use where you don't necessarily have to deprive yourself of every single treat ever. Of course, limit it, everything in moderation, but how you choose to eat that carbohydrate will completely differ your blood sugars after the fact. So ordering your food in a way where your sugar follows something like fiber can be an incredibly useful tool for balancing out blood sugars. But fiber isn't the only thing that can buffer your blood sugars. Protein and fat can also do this. So again, it's about eating those things before you eat the carbohydrate so that when the carbohydrate or the high sugar food hits your stomach, it's also full of protein and fat, which slows the absorption of that other food. If we start by looking at protein, it's important to note that protein, unlike fat, can also elevate your blood sugars. This is because the amino acids that make up protein can get converted to something like glucose and then get released into the bloodstream. The important distinction, though, is that protein releases over a long period of time. A, it's slow to absorb, but B, it needs to get converted. So you don't really get those spikes in your blood sugar. You'll just get a slow and steady release into your blood sugar, which is really what we're after. And it can do so for up to 5 hours after your meal. So in that sense, it's actually quite beneficial because in addition to preventing spikes in blood glucose, we also want to prevent super big dips in blood glucose because as I mentioned earlier, that's when you're going to notice a drop in your energy, intense cravings, for some people anxiety and irritability. So we don't want any of those dips either. So protein is lovely in the sense that it causes a nice slow and steady release into the blood. So again, if you eat the protein before the sugar, it will help slow the release of that sugar. And also it's important to note that most of us are quite deficient in protein. So just as a quick aside, we need at least 1 gram per kilogram of weight in order to not be deficient in protein. So that can also be another area that if you're into the numbers, you might want to evaluate how much protein you're getting in a day. In someone who's really active, trying to put on muscle, things like that, it's actually 2 grams per kilogram of weight. So by increasing the protein in your diet, you're inevitably going to decrease the amount of carbohydrate in your diet. There's only so many foods you can eat in a day. So rather than focusing on don't eat carbs, I'm scared of carbs, focus on increase my protein, increase protein before a carb, things like that. Last but not least, let's talk about fat. So fat, unlike protein and carbohydrates, does not create an insulin response. It's not that fat can't get converted into glucose, but it's an extremely inefficient process. So your body really won't do it unless it absolutely has to, aka you are on a ketogenic diet or something like that. So the fat is a really hard to digest source of energy as well. So it will slow digestion down and again buffer that carbohydrate. So fat, protein, fiber before your carbohydrate will slow down digestion and slow the release of sugars into your bloodstream, which is really what we're trying to accomplish here. But just because fat doesn't create an insulin response does not mean it has no place in diabetes. So this is really where we get into some of the other aspect of diabetes, where I don't have enough time to talk about it today, but I will briefly touch on it when it comes to fats. And that is inflammation. Certain types of fats are incredibly inflammatory inside of the body. Just think of something like fried foods. Fried foods are obviously not good for you. And that's because the oil inside of that fried food is an incredibly inflammatory type of oil. And inflammation will actually increase your risk of developing diabetes and insulin resistance. And so this is through a bit of a different mechanism than the blood sugar spikes, but it's important nonetheless. So you do want to make sure that you're choosing high quality fat. So that would be things like cold pressed organic olive oil, flaxseed oil, avocado oil, grass-fed butter or ghee. These high quality nutrient dense oils are actually anti-inflammatory, really good for the body, important for improving insulin resistance. That being said, if you fry the crap out of those oils, no matter how good the oil is, it will go rancid and create an inflammatory type of oil. So that's why you also need to pay attention to not overheat your oils. So paying attention to the smoke point of the oil can be incredibly helpful. But generally speaking, making sure you're choosing high quality oils and not overcooking them will help you when it comes to preventing diabetes or managing your blood sugars. And again, if you eat that fat before your carbohydrate, it's going to help from a blood sugar spiking standpoint as well. All right, that's it. This is how I balance out my patients' blood sugars through a protein, carbohydrate, and fat standpoint. That alone will improve your blood sugars tremendously. In future videos, I do want to go into some of the other areas that will help your blood sugars, like managing your sleep, managing your stress, exercise, things like that. So it's not just diet alone that can help your blood sugars. Of course, we always need to take into context the whole person, the whole body, but at least for today's video, those are some really good fundamentals of diet. Please leave a comment below if there are any other topics that you want me to dive into. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.